"Ma'am, step out of the vehicle now." The command cut through the humid night air like a blade, sharp enough to silence the low hum of traffic and the distant murmur of late-night voices along the sidewalk. Angela Brooks didn't move right away. Her hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, fingers still, steady, as if the moment itself had paused inside her. Red and blue lights pulsed across the windshield, painting her face in alternating shadows, then color, then shadow again. Outside, Officer Daniel Hayes stood rigid, one hand hovering near his belt, the other gesturing impatiently toward the door. A small crowd had already begun to gather, drawn in by the spectacle of flashing lights and raised voices, phones subtly lifting into the air, recording without permission, without context. Angela exhaled slowly, her breath fogging the glass for just a second before disappearing, like it had never been there. When she finally opened the door, it wasn't with hesitation, it was deliberate, controlled. The click echoed louder than it should have. Her heels met the pavement with a soft, measured sound. One step, then another, her posture straight despite the tension pressing in from every direction. "Hands where I can see them," the second officer, Mark Collins, added, his tone edged with something colder than authority. Angela raised her hands calmly, palms open, her eyes scanning the scene, not in fear, but in quiet awareness. The streetlight above flickered once, casting a pale glow over the damp asphalt, and for a moment, everything felt suspended, like a photograph no one had taken yet. A teenager near the curb whispered something under his breath, his phone angled just enough to catch her face, her expression, the stillness that didn't match the urgency around her. Hayes stepped closer, his boots scraping lightly against the ground, the sound sharp in the silence that had settled over the crowd. "You didn't hear me the first time," he said, voice low but carrying. Angela turned her head slightly toward him, not fully, just enough to meet his eyes. There was no defiance there, no panic, just something steady, something that didn't belong in a moment like this. "I heard you," she replied, her voice even, almost quiet, but it landed heavier than the command that had started it all. For a split second, the officer hesitated, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough to shift the air between them. A car passed slowly down the street, its headlights sweeping across the scene, illuminating the faces of the onlookers, curious, cautious, some uncomfortable, others indifferent. Angela's gaze moved briefly to a young child standing beside his mother on the sidewalk, his small hand clutching hers tightly, his eyes wide as he watched everything unfold. She offered him the faintest nod, a gesture so small it almost disappeared in the chaos. But it was there, an anchor of calm in a moment that felt anything but. Behind her, the open car door creaked softly as it shifted, the interior light casting a warm glow that contrasted sharply with the cold flashes of the patrol car. Hayes reached forward, not aggressively, but with an impatience that spoke louder than force, guiding her a step away from the vehicle. The movement was enough to ripple through the crowd, phones adjusting, whispers rising just slightly before falling again. Angela didn't resist. She didn't rush. She simply moved, one controlled step at a time, her composure unbroken, her silence louder than any protest could have been. And in that silence, something subtle began to change, something no one could quite name yet, but everyone could feel. Angela's wrists remained lifted, steady at shoulder height, her palms open to the cool night air, as if she had practiced this moment 1,000 times before, not because she expected it, but because she understood how quickly control could be taken from you when others decided who you were before you spoke a single word. And still she said nothing, not when Officer Collins stepped closer and circled behind her, not when the faint metallic click of handcuffs echoed softer than it should have, against the hum of the street, not even when the small crowd shifted again, bodies leaning forward just slightly, curiosity tightening the space around her like an invisible wall, and somewhere in that crowd a voice whispered, barely audible, asking what she had done, but no one answered because no one actually knew, and Angela seemed to understand that better than anyone, her gaze drifting forward instead of down, fixed on a point across the street where a storefront window reflected the entire scene back at her, flashing lights, uniforms, raised phones, and her own silhouette standing still in the center of it all like the only unmoving piece in a world that had suddenly decided to spin faster, and for a brief second her eyes softened, not with fear, but with recognition, as if she had seen this pattern before, in different places, under different lights, with different faces wearing the same certainty, and behind her Collins adjusted his grip, not harsh, but firm, the kind of control that came from habit rather than thought, guiding her a step toward the patrol car, while Hayes spoke again, his voice sharper now, edged with the pressure of being watched. "You are going to cooperate, understood?" And Angela nodded. Once, a small motion, controlled, her voice following a beat later, calm enough to feel out of place. "I am cooperating." And the simplicity of it seemed to hang there longer than expected, long enough that Hayes blinked, just once, before turning his attention outward, scanning the onlookers as if their presence was suddenly more inconvenient than reassuring. And across the street, the child who had been watching tightened his grip on his mother's hand again, his eyes tracking Angela as she moved, step by measured step, toward the back of the cruiser, the door already open, its interior dimly lit, a quiet space waiting to swallow the moment whole. And just before she reached it, Angela paused, not resisting, not pulling away, just stopping long enough to glance toward the ground where a small object had rolled free from her bag when she stepped out earlier, a phone, its screen still lit, casting a faint glow against the pavement. And for a moment no one else noticed it. Not Hayes. Not Collins. Not the crowd. But Angela did. And her eyes lingered there for a second longer than necessary before she lifted them again, her composure unbroken, and allowed herself to be guided forward once more, the door frame brushing lightly against her shoulder as she stepped inside, the leather seat cool beneath her, the confined space closing in without sound, and outside the world continued to move, voices rising and falling, engines passing, the low static of the police radio crackling from the front seat. And through it all, Angela sat upright, her back straight, her breathing slow and even, as if she were waiting, not for permission, not for release, but for something else entirely. Something unseen that had not yet entered the scene. And in the reflection of the window beside her, the flashing lights painted her face again in alternating colors, red, then blue, then red, each pulse revealing the same expression, steady, patient, unshaken, as though the outcome of this moment had already been decided somewhere far beyond the reach of the street, the officers, or the watching crowd. And all that remained now was for the rest of the world to catch up. The patrol car door closed with a muted thud that seemed to seal the moment in place, cutting Angela off from the noise outside, while not quite silencing it. The voices and movement now softened into a distant blur that pressed faintly through the glass. And in the front seat, Officer Hayes exhaled slowly, one hand resting on the steering wheel, as the radio crackled with overlapping dispatch calls that came and went like static waves, none of them urgent enough to pull his focus away from the situation behind him. Not tonight. Not with a growing audience still lingering on the sidewalk. And Officer Collins shifted in the passenger seat, glancing back through the metal divider, his eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to read something in Angela's stillness that did not match the script he had already decided was true, because she was not arguing, not pleading, not even asking questions. She simply sat there, upright, composed, her gaze fixed forward at the faint reflection in the window where the city lights stretched and distorted into long streaks of color. And for a moment Collins tapped his fingers lightly against his knee, a small, restless rhythm that broke the quiet inside the vehicle. "You want to tell us why you were stopped?" he asked, his tone measured but edged with expectation, and Angela turned her head just slightly, enough for her voice to carry without raising it. "You already decided that before you asked," she said, calm, direct, and the words settled into the space between them with a weight that neither officer immediately answered. Hayes adjusted his posture, clearing his throat as if to reset the tone. "You were flagged driving through a restricted zone," he replied, keeping his eyes forward, though his grip on the wheel tightened just enough to be noticed. "Late at night, matching a report." And Angela listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, but there was a faint shift in her breathing, slower now, more deliberate, as if she were measuring each second instead of reacting to it. And outside the car a passing truck rolled by, its headlights sweeping across the windshield, illuminating the dashboard in a brief wash of white before fading again into the rhythm of red and blue. And somewhere in that transition the radio crackled louder, A new voice cutting through the static. Sharp. Official. Unit 12, confirm location, the dispatcher said, and Hayes reached for the mic without hesitation, pressing the button with a practiced motion. Unit 12 on scene. Traffic stop. No further issues. He responded, his voice steady, routine. The kind of tone that closed situations before they escalated, but the dispatcher did not immediately reply. And that pause, brief but noticeable, stretched just long enough to pull Collins's attention forward again, his brow tightening slightly. Copy. The voice finally returned, but there was something underneath it, something unsaid that lingered even after the line went quiet, and Angela's eyes flickered once toward the front, not fully, just enough to acknowledge the shift, as if she had heard more in that exchange than the words themselves. And Collins leaned back in his seat, exhaling through his nose. We will sort it out at the station, he muttered, more to himself than to her. But Angela responded anyway, her voice still even. That will not be necessary. And this time both officers reacted, Hayes glancing briefly into the rearview mirror, Collins turning halfway in his seat. That is not your call, Hayes said, the edge returning to his tone. But Angela did not raise her voice, did not challenge him directly. She simply held his gaze through the mirror, steady, unwavering. And for a moment the only sound inside the car was the low hum of the engine idling and the distant echo of footsteps outside as the crowd slowly began to thin, the spectacle losing its novelty. And Angela's reflection remained in the glass, framed by the alternating lights, her composure untouched, her silence no longer passive but intentional, like a line drawn that no one else could yet see. And in that quiet, something began to shift again, subtle but undeniable, the kind of change that did not announce itself, but once felt, could not be ignored. The engine continued to idle, a low, constant vibration beneath everything, as if the car itself was waiting for a decision no one had made yet. And Officer Hayes shifted again in his seat, glancing toward the side mirror where the last few onlookers were beginning to disperse, their silhouettes thinning under the dim streetlights, phones lowering, interest fading now that the moment seemed to have settled into something quieter, less dramatic. But inside the vehicle the air had not relaxed, it had tightened, drawn thin by something neither officer could quite name, and Collins leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees, his gaze fixed on the dashboard before flicking once more to the rear, studying Angela as if expecting her to change, to break, to finally match the situation they had constructed around her. But she did not. Her posture remained unchanged, her breathing steady, her eyes no longer on the window, but now resting calmly on the back of Hayes's seat, as if she were observing not just the moment, but the choices being made inside it. And Hayes reached again for the radio, his thumb hovering over the button for a second longer than before, a hesitation so small it could have been missed, but it was there, rooted in the earlier pause from dispatch, in the tone that had not quite aligned with routine. And when he finally pressed it, his voice carried a subtle shift, still controlled, but edged with something closer to caution. Dispatch, confirm status on restricted zone alert, he said, his words precise, measured, and the response did not come immediately, the static stretching just long enough to fill the silence with unease, and Collins exhaled slowly, tapping his fingers once against the dash before stopping himself, as if even that small sound felt out of place now. And behind them Angela closed her eyes for a brief second, not in exhaustion, not in defeat, but in something closer to patience, as if she were allowing the moment to unfold at its own pace. And when she opened them again, her voice followed, quiet but certain. The report you are referring to was cleared 12 minutes ago, she said, not as a challenge, not as a question, but as a statement, and both officers reacted. Hayes's hand tightening slightly around the radio, Collins turning fully now, his brows pulling together. You do not have access to that, Collins said, his tone sharper, more defensive than before, but Angela did not look at him. She kept her gaze forward, her voice steady. Access is not always about permission, she replied, and the words landed differently this time, not confrontational, but layered, suggesting something just beyond their reach. And the radio finally came alive again, the dispatcher's voice cutting through, more direct now, less casual. Unit 12. Stand by, she said, And there was movement behind that voice. The faint shuffle of papers, another voice in the background, lower, urgent, not fully audible, but present enough to shift the tone entirely. And Hayes froze for a fraction of a second before answering, standing by. His voice quieter now, the authority still there, but no longer absolute. And Collins leaned back slowly. His earlier confidence replaced by a growing uncertainty he could not fully mask, his eyes drifting again to Angela, searching for something, any sign that would explain the shift, but she offered none, her expression unchanged, her composure intact. And outside the car a black SUV turned onto the street, its headlights cutting cleanly through the fading crowd, slowing as it approached, its presence subtle at first, then undeniable as it rolled to a controlled stop several yards behind the patrol car, its engine low, powerful, the kind of vehicle that did not arrive without purpose. And Hayes noticed it in the mirror, his eyes narrowing slightly as he adjusted his posture, his attention splitting now between the radio in his hand and the new arrival behind him. And for the first time since the stop began, the certainty that had driven his actions began to fracture, just slightly, just enough for doubt to slip in, quiet, persistent, and impossible to ignore. The black SUV idled behind the patrol car, its headlights steady and unwavering, casting long shadows that stretched across the pavement and touched the back of the cruiser like a quiet signal that something had shifted beyond the control of the moment. And inside the patrol car, Officer Hayes felt it before he fully understood it, a subtle tightening in his chest, a sense that the situation was no longer contained within the boundaries he had assumed. And Collins turned slightly in his seat, craning his neck just enough to catch a clearer view through the rear window, his earlier confidence now replaced by a cautious curiosity. "Do you know them?" he asked, his voice lower than before, less certain. But Angela did not answer immediately. She simply watched the reflection of the SUV's lights ripple across the glass beside her, her expression unchanged, her posture still composed, as if the arrival had been expected, not surprising. And that silence lingered just long enough to unsettle both officers further, because it was not resistance, it was not fear, it was something else entirely, something that suggested she understood more about what was happening than they did. And Hayes cleared his throat, shifting his attention back to the radio, pressing the button again with a firmer motion this time. "Dispatch, confirm additional unit on scene," he said, his tone controlled but edged with a growing urgency. And the reply came faster now, sharper. "Unit 12, remain where you are," the dispatcher said, her voice carrying a weight that had not been there earlier. "Do not proceed." And the words hung in the air like a command that had nothing to do with routine procedure. And Hayes froze for a fraction of a second, his grip tightening around the radio as he processed the instruction, because it was not how these situations usually unfolded. It was not how control was supposed to shift. And Collins leaned back slowly, his eyes moving from the radio to the mirror, then to Angela again, searching her face for any sign that would explain the sudden change. But she remained steady, her gaze calm, her breathing even. And outside, the SUV's driver's side door opened with a soft, deliberate motion, not rushed, not aggressive, just precise. And a figure stepped out, tall, composed, dressed in a dark suit that contrasted sharply with the casual disarray of the scene. And the man did not move quickly. He did not raise his voice. He simply walked forward with a quiet authority that seemed to part the remaining onlookers. Without effort, and Hayes noticed immediately, his posture straightening instinctively, a reaction that came from training, from recognition. Even if he had not yet placed the face, and Collins followed his gaze, his expression tightening as the man approached, each step measured, each movement controlled. And the closer he came, the clearer it became that this was not a coincidence, not a passerby, but someone who belonged to a different level of the system they operated within. And inside the car, Angela finally shifted her gaze, not toward the officers, but toward the approaching figure, her eyes steady, her expression unchanged. But there was something there now, something subtle, like a quiet confirmation of what she had already known. And Hayes opened the door slowly, stepping out onto the pavement, the cool night air hitting him as he squared his shoulders, his earlier certainty now replaced by a careful formality. "Sir," he said, his voice measured, respectful, though he had not yet spoken a name. and the man stopped a few feet away, his eyes moving briefly from Hayes to Collins, then to the patrol car behind them, where Angela sat, visible through the glass, and in that moment the silence returned, heavier than before, not empty, but filled with the weight of something about to be revealed, something that neither officer could stop now. And for the first time since the stop began, Hayes felt the ground beneath the situation shift completely, not with force, not with noise, but with the quiet certainty that whatever came next would not follow the path he had expected. The night seemed to exhale as the man in the dark suit came to a stop just short of the patrol car, his presence quiet but undeniable, the kind of authority that did not need to announce itself because it was already understood by those who recognized it. And Officer Hayes felt that recognition settle in his chest before his mind fully caught up, his posture straightening further, his voice lowering instinctively. "Sir," he repeated, this time with a sharper edge of formality, while Collins stepped out on the other side, closing the door behind him with a controlled motion, his eyes moving between the man and the vehicle as if trying to piece together something that was unfolding faster than he could process. And the suited man did not respond immediately, his gaze shifting past them to the back seat where Angela sat, still, composed, her silhouette framed by the dim interior light. And for a brief second the world seemed to narrow to that single line of sight, his eyes meeting hers through the glass, and something unspoken passed between them, something that did not need words to be understood, and only then did he look back at the officers, his expression calm, measured, but firm in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. "Open the door," he said, his voice low but carrying, not raised, not aggressive, just absolute, and Hayes hesitated, not out of defiance, but out of the sudden realization that he no longer fully understood his position in this moment, his hand hovering near the handle as his mind raced through protocol, through procedure, searching for something that would anchor him, but finding nothing that fit the weight of the command he had just been given, and Collins shifted beside him, his earlier certainty now completely gone, replaced by a tension he could not hide. "Sir, we are in the middle of," he began. But the man cut him off without raising his voice. "You are in the middle of something you do not understand," he said, his tone steady, his gaze unwavering, and the words landed heavier than any raised voice could have, silencing the rest of Collins's sentence before it could form, and behind them the patrol car's radio crackled again. A burst of static followed by the dispatcher's voice, clearer now, more direct than before. "Unit 12, stand down," she said, each word precise, deliberate, leaving no room for interpretation, and Hayes felt it then, the final shift, the moment where control slipped completely from his grasp, not violently, not abruptly, but with a quiet certainty that could not be reversed, and slowly, almost mechanically, he reached for the rear door, his hand closing around the handle, the metal cool beneath his fingers, and for a brief second he paused, his reflection staring back at him in the darkened glass. A man who had entered this moment with confidence and now stood at its edge with something far more uncertain. And then he opened the door, the latch releasing with a soft click that seemed louder than it should have, and the interior light spilled outward, illuminating Angela's face fully for the first time, calm, composed, her eyes lifting to meet his without anger, without fear, just a steady awareness that seemed to reach beyond the moment itself, and the suited man stepped forward slightly, not rushing, not imposing, just present, and Angela shifted, bringing her hands forward slightly, not in resistance, but in readiness, as if the next step had already been decided long before this night began, and Hayes swallowed, his voice catching for the first time as he spoke, quieter now, stripped of its earlier authority. "Ma'am," and the word lingered, incomplete, because whatever came after it no longer belonged to him. And in that silence, the truth of the situation began to surface, not fully revealed yet, but undeniable in its presence, pressing in on both officers from every direction, leaving them standing in a moment they could no longer control, only witness. As it unfolded, Angela stepped out of the patrol car slowly, not because she was unsure, but because the moment itself demanded precision, her shoes meeting the pavement with a quiet, grounded certainty that contrasted sharply with the tension still hanging in the air, and for a second no one spoke, not Officer Hayes, not Officer Collins, not even the man in the suit who had initiated the shift, because the weight of what was about to be revealed seemed to hold every word back just long enough to make it matter, and Angela lifted her hand slightly, glancing down at the cuffs with a calm expression before looking back up, her eyes settling briefly on Hayes, not accusing, not angry, just present, and Hayes felt that look more than he understood it, a steady gaze that did not challenge him but did not excuse him either, and the suited man stepped closer, his attention focused fully on Angela now, his voice softening just enough to signal familiarity. "Ma'am," he said, a single word, respectful. "Certain," and Angela gave a small nod in return, acknowledging him without shifting her composure. And that single exchange was enough for Collins to straighten instinctively, enough for Hayes's breath to catch slightly as the pieces began to align in a way neither of them had anticipated, and the man turned slightly toward the officers, his expression no longer neutral but firm in a way that carried both authority and expectation. "Remove them," he said, nodding toward the cuffs, and this time there was no hesitation. Hayes stepped forward immediately, his hands moving with a careful urgency as he reached for the restraint, the metal clicking softly as it released, and Angela lowered her arms without comment, rubbing her wrist lightly for a brief second before letting her hand fall naturally to her side, her posture unchanged, her calm intact, and Collins took a half step back, his earlier confidence now replaced by something closer to unease, his eyes moving between Angela and the suited man as if searching for confirmation of what he was beginning to understand, and it came not through explanation, but through tone, through presence, through the quiet shift in how everyone around them was now standing, how the space itself seemed to reorganize around Angela without a single command being spoken, and Hayes swallowed, his voice quieter now, stripped of assumption. "Ma'am, we were not informed," he began, but Angela raised her hand slightly, not to interrupt, but to pause him, the gesture controlled, respectful, and he stopped immediately, the rest of his sentence dissolving before it could form, and she looked at him then, directly, her voice even, steady. "You acted on what you believed you saw," she said, and there was no anger in it, no accusation, just a statement that carried more weight than any reprimand could have, and Hayes nodded once, slowly, because there was nothing else he could do in that moment. No defense that would not sound hollow, no explanation that would change what had already happened, and the suited man stepped slightly to the side, allowing space to open around Angela as if the center of the scene had shifted entirely to her, and in the distance the remaining onlookers had gone quiet, their earlier curiosity replaced by a subtle awareness that something significant had just unfolded, even if they did not fully understand it. And Angela took a breath, slow, measured, her eyes lifting briefly toward the streetlights above before returning to the officers in front of her. And for the first time since the night began, the silence did not feel tense. It felt intentional, like the moment before a truth is spoken that cannot be taken back. And when she finally moved, it was not away from them, not yet, but forward, one step, then another, her presence steady, her composure unshaken. And in that movement the final layer of realization settled over both officers, not with shock, not with noise, but with a quiet, undeniable clarity that left them standing exactly where they were, watching as the person they had misjudged became the one who now defined what happened next. The air settled into a quiet that felt heavier than any command that had been spoken before, and Angela stood there for a moment without moving, her presence steady, grounded, as if the entire scene had finally aligned with something deeper than the surface misunderstanding that had brought it here, and Officer Hayes lowered his gaze briefly, not out of weakness, but out of recognition, the kind that arrives slowly and then all at once. And when he looked back up, his voice carried none of the earlier certainty, only a careful respect that had not been there before. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology," he said, each word deliberate, measured, and Collins remained silent beside him, his posture stiff, his expression tight as he processed the weight of what had unfolded, the shift in power, the realization that the situation they had controlled minutes ago was now something entirely different, something that reflected back on them instead of forward, and Angela listened without interruption, her eyes steady on Hayes, not soft, not harsh, simply present, and when she spoke, Her voice was calm, even, but carried a clarity that cut through the silence without force. "This is not about an apology," she said, and the words landed quietly, but with undeniable weight, and Hayes straightened slightly, as if bracing for something more. But Angela did not raise her voice. She did not step closer. She simply continued, "It is about what you saw when you looked at me." And that sentence hung in the air longer than anything else that had been said that night, because it reached beyond the moment, beyond the stop, beyond the misunderstanding. And Collins shifted his stance, his eyes dropping for a second before returning to her, unable to fully hold her gaze. And the suited man remained just behind Angela, silent, allowing her words to take the space they needed, not intervening, not directing, simply present as a witness to what was unfolding. And Hayes inhaled slowly, the weight of her words settling in, because there was no immediate response that would undo what had already been done, no quick explanation that would restore the balance that had been broken. And Angela glanced briefly toward the patrol car, then back to the officers, her voice still steady. "You followed procedure," she said, and for a moment Hayes nodded instinctively, grasping at that acknowledgement. But she did not stop there. "But you forgot the person," she added, and that was the line that shifted everything. Not loud, not accusatory, but precise, undeniable. And Collins exhaled quietly, his shoulders dropping just slightly, as if something inside him had been forced to settle, and the street around them remained still, the earlier noise gone now, replaced by a quiet awareness that something meaningful had just taken place, even if the onlookers had already moved on. And Angela took a small step back, creating space again, not retreating, but resetting the boundary between them. And her gaze softened just slightly, not with forgiveness, not yet, but with something closer to understanding, the kind that acknowledges complexity without excusing harm. And Hayes lowered his head for a brief second, a gesture small but genuine, before lifting it again, his voice quieter now. "I understand," he said, though it was clear that what he understood was only the beginning of something much larger. And Angela gave a slight nod, accepting the effort without validating the conclusion. And then she turned, not abruptly, not dismissively, but with a calm finality, stepping toward the black SUV that had been waiting behind the scene, her movement smooth, unhurried, as if she had already decided what this moment meant long before it had ended. And the suited man followed a step behind, opening the door for her without a word. And before she entered, Angela paused for just a second, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the door as she looked back once more, not at them as officers, but as individuals, her voice carrying one last time across the quiet street. "Power is not in the badge," she said. "It is in how you choose to see people." And then she stepped inside, the door closing softly behind her, leaving the two men standing in the fading glow of the patrol lights, their reflections stretching across the pavement, unchanged in form, but altered in meaning, as the realization of what had just happened settled in, fully, quiet, irreversible, and deeply human. The black SUV pulled away slowly, its taillights glowing red against the dark pavement before fading into the distance, leaving behind a silence that felt deeper than the noise that had come before it. And Officer Hayes remained standing where he was, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his gaze fixed on the empty stretch of road, as if something in him had not yet caught up with what had just happened. While Officer Collins shifted his weight beside him, the tension in his shoulders no longer sharp but heavy, settled, like something that would not leave quickly. And the patrol car lights continued to flash behind them, casting alternating colors across their uniforms, across the street, across the space where Angela had stood just moments ago, and neither of them moved to turn them off right away, as if the rhythm of those lights was the only thing still holding the moment together. And Hayes exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him in a way that felt different from before, less controlled, more real. And he glanced down at his hands for a second, the same hands that had acted with certainty earlier, now still, quiet, and he shook his head slightly, not in denial, but in recognition. "We missed it," he said, his voice low, almost to himself. And Collins did not answer immediately, his eyes still on the road, following where the SUV had disappeared. And after a moment he nodded once, a small, restrained motion. "Yeah," he replied, the word carrying more weight than its simplicity suggested, and a car passed by slowly, its driver glancing at them before continuing on, the world outside already moving forward, already letting the moment slip into memory. But for Hayes and Collins, it had not passed. Not yet. And Hayes reached up and finally switched off the patrol lights. The sudden absence of flashing color leaving the street dimmer, quieter, more honest, and the stillness that followed was not empty. It was reflective, as if the absence of noise had made room for something else to surface, something they could not ignore, and Collins turned slightly, looking at Hayes with a different expression now, less defensive, more open. She was calm the whole time, he said, not as an observation, but as a realization, and Hayes nodded slowly, his eyes lowering again for a brief second. Because she knew something we did. Not, he replied, and the words settled between them. Not accusatory, not blaming, just true. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching out, filled only by the distant hum of the city and the faint rustle of wind moving through the street. And then Hayes took a step forward, moving toward the patrol car, his movements slower now, more deliberate, as if each action carried more weight than it had before. And he paused at the open door, resting his hand on the frame, his reflection faintly visible in the glass. And for a second he just stood there, looking at himself, not at his uniform, not at the badge pinned to his chest, but at the man behind it. And Collins remained a few feet away, watching, understanding without needing it explained, and Hayes finally spoke again, his voice quiet but steady. "We cannot undo it," he said, and Collins nodded, stepping closer now. "No," he answered, "but we can remember it." And Hayes looked up, meeting his partner's eyes. And there was something different there now, something that had not been there before, not just awareness, but responsibility, the kind that does not come from rules or training, but from moments that force you to see yourself clearly. And Hayes straightened, closing the car door gently, the sound soft against the quiet street. And without another word they both moved back toward their seats, not rushing, not speaking, just carrying the weight of what had happened with them. And as the engine started again, the low hum filling the space, Hayes glanced once more down the road where the SUV had disappeared, and for a brief moment, the image of Angela standing there, calm, steady, unshaken, returned to him, not as a memory of conflict, but as a reflection of something he had not seen clearly before, something he would not forget now. And the patrol car pulled away slowly, merging back into the flow of the city, leaving behind an empty street that felt quieter than it should have, as if the silence itself had something to say, something that did not need words, only the space to be heard.